This is chapter 10 on the bureaucracy. We start out with the first question, what is a bureaucracy and how does it work? Well, you can find a lot of different definitions of bureaucracy in textbooks, but I like the one that I used here. Bureaucracy are the people, I should say people in the government, who carry out the laws that are enacted. So those who make sure that the laws are properly enforced. That's the bureaucracy. So it's all the people involved in carrying out the laws, whether those laws are laws passed by Congress or Supreme Court decisions or directives from the president. So all those kinds of people are usually part of the bureaucracy. So for example, a good example of the bureaucracy would be the police. The police are bureaucrats who carry out the role of the law, which says that certain behaviors, for example, are unlawful. For example, like gambling or murder or jaywalking, or any series of things that have been declared to be unlawful. And so you need somebody who's going to make sure that that happens. That is, that people don't jaywalk or murder people. And the end result is going to be that there's going to be a whole lot of people who are involved in carrying out the law or seeing to it that the law is enforced. Bureaucracy contains at least two things. It contains a structure and then a set of rules. So the structure would be, the nature of the organization, like who's at the top of the organization, and then all the different people in it. Like you have some departments in the national government that are very, very big, like the Department of Agriculture. So you've got a Secretary of Agriculture who's at the top of the structure, who answers only to the president. And then you've got representatives of the agriculture department throughout the whole United States, in just about every county in the United States, because there's some rural dimension, farming, in every single state. And so in almost every county in the United States, which has a rural component, they're going to have a Department of Agriculture extension in that county. So that's the structure. And so it's all across the whole United States, a huge, huge department, and several secretaries and undersecretaries running the thing. And then a set of rules. Bureaucracy is always based on rules. That is, there's an attempt to carry out the law in a specific way. And the characteristics that are listed here are the specific things that are part of the rules. So number one would be that the bureaucracy attempts to be objective and neutral. And I also said here that it's the opposite of political. If we look at political organization, the way patronage was run before we had a civil service, that is, people who are appointed supposedly based on their qualifications for office, and they cannot be fired for political reasons. These people are fundamentally different, or the opposite of the way political organizations ran. Before you had civil service, you had, whenever the Democrats would win, like the Democrats would win to be governor, the governor would be a Democrat, then all the offices in the state would be turned over to Democrats and all the Republicans would be fired. So that's how it worked. So it's the opposite of this. It's objective and neutral. That is, when the government is enforcing the law, say it's Social Security or the police, as I mentioned before, or anything else, they're supposed to be objective and neutral. That is, applying the law the same way to everybody. Like in Social Security, in order to get Social Security, you have to reach a certain age of maturity. Um, for people of my generation, it's 66. So you have to get to age 66, and then you can get benefits. And so they're not going to give benefits to people who are 65 or 64 or anything under that, if it's objective and neutral. There are some exceptions to this. You can take early retirement and all that kind of thing. But for the most part, the idea is that you have to apply within the rules, and the rules are paramount. And there's a neutrality. It doesn't matter who you are, rich or poor, black or white. They're going to apply them the same way. At least that's the approach that bureaucracy attempts to take. The second thing is efficiency. That is, you try to do things as cheaply as possible. You're not trying to spend money. You're trying to be efficient. That kind of tends to go out the window given the nature of how bureaucracy operates. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Another characteristic is professionalism. That is, people go to school, they're hired to be bureaucrats, they have training for it, whether it's in the foreign service or it's domestic. People get master's degrees, some even get PhDs in things like public policy in an effort to be professional. And again, that's the opposite of the political approach, where people didn't have qualifications or don't have qualifications. There's still a lot of offices like that in Washington, D.C. The president appoints quite a few patronage type positions, like ambassadorships, and those almost all go to people who gave contributions to the candidate when he or she was running. So the end result is they're not professional, they're political, and they usually don't have any qualifications for the job. That's what happened in the case of FEMA during Katrina, when President Bush's leader of FEMA, I forget his name right now, but he had no real background in any kind of emergency or involvement with the kind of things that FEMA does, which is whenever there's a thing like Katrina, which is a flood, then to help disaster victims and relocate people and provide for temporary housing and all of that sort of thing. When that all went wrong in New Orleans after Katrina, the criticism went to the head of FEMA because he didn't have any background in this kind of stuff, and the fact that they were making huge mistakes was probably the result of the fact that he didn't know what to do. His background had been in Arabian horses, training Arabian horses or representing Arabian horses as an interest group, and his claim to fame, or the reason he became head of FEMA, was because he was a big contributor to President Bush. But that's typical of what happens in political organization, and it's the opposite of what is attempted to happen with the bureaucracy in the modern 21st century. And then the last thing is that people are careerists. That is to say, they stay in office as long as a normal span, a working lifespan of a person, somewhere between 20 and 30 years or so, and then they retire. So they're not kicked out, they're not treated as political people. They're more or less treated like, run like a private business in a sense, that you hire the people who are best qualified for the job, and they stay on that job as long as they do a good job. Here's a couple examples. One is we follow the rules. That's typical of bureaucracy, that it's all about rules and how they're going to be enforced, because they want to obtain that first thing I mentioned, which was objectivity. And the way to do that is to say everybody's going to be treated the same way under the rules. And then here's a kind of a cartoonish look at bureaucrats. Your tax dollars not at work. Oftentimes when they're building highways, they put up a sign that says your tax dollars at work, and it shows you who's contributing, what level of government is contributing to the highway. Well, there's a major criticism of bureaucracies that people don't work, that they're just kind of loafing on the job, or it takes them 3 or 4 hours to do work that should have been done in an hour, stuff like that. So here's that criticism again. Here's an interesting one too. This is also a criticism of the bureaucracy. Um, the first person on the left says, I don't like Clinton's idea about cutting the ranks of us in the federal government. I'm going to write him a nasty letter. So here's the bureaucrats at the coffee saying that they don't like the idea that the bureaucracy is going to be cut because it means their jobs. The second person says, I'll stuff it in an envelope. So one guy's going to write the nasty letter, and the other guy says, I'm going to stuff it in an envelope. And the next guy says, I'll lick the stamp. And the third one says, now, if we could just have extra staff to mail it. So here's the kind of, this is another criticism of bureaucracy, that is highly specialized. I didn't mention that, but it's highly specialized. Everybody has a particular thing that they do, particular expertise, and of course the idea that there's way more of them than is needed. So that's the criticism here. Here's a picture. I'm not sure which one of the cabinets this was. You got President Obama and Vice President Biden in the middle here, and the rest of these people are all cabinet members. So you can kind of see these people are all heads of a bureaucratic department. Like here's right next to Biden on the right is Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State. Okay, here's the cabinet members sitting around a table in a cabinet meeting with the president over here at the middle and on the right. Again, I'm not sure what year this was, but I think the person closest to the screen here in the middle was his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, now mayor of Chicago. But one of the things that you can see here is that bureaucracy heads is pretty big, because there's more of them than even that can sit around a table. A number of them are sitting along the outside because there isn't room for them at the table. Here's a cabinet meeting. You get a better chance to see that there's people are on the outside, because not everybody fits around the table. During the presidency of President Nixon, President Nixon is in the same position, middle of the table, on the right, the same position that Bush was in. That Obama was in. All right, let's get to the second question. Why do we have a large bureaucracy in the United States? Well, the first thing is because we have so many laws. Probably a day doesn't go by that we don't have some kind of new ruling coming out of the President, Congress, or the Supreme Court. And the more laws you have, the more the need for administrators or somebody to carry them out will be. So that's a common reason why we have a large bureaucracy. It's just a lot of laws. There's a notion that the way to solve problems is to pass laws or some kind of decree by the president or Supreme Court decision. Secondly is the demand for equal goods and services, that is, what is fair. We have a large bureaucracy because we're trying to administer things, as I said in the first slide, with regard to things like objectivity and neutrality and so on. We're trying to do that, and you have to have a lot of people in order to do that. If you don't have enough bureaucrats, you don't get the job done. And that's classically what happens. Oftentimes, if the president doesn't like a particular department or agency, you just have to cut the bureaucracy, and then they won't be able to do their job. A good example is food inspectors. The federal government inspects all the food we eat, or at least it's supposed to. And there's a tremendous problem of, say, having inspectors inspecting at the slaughterhouse for meat, or inspecting foreign food that comes in, like fish from other countries. And so there's not enough people, and because there's not enough people, they really only deal with about 10% of the food that comes into the country. They're only able to really inspect about 10%, and that's why a lot of times it comes in contaminated, and then there has to be a recall. So there's recall after recall after recall, whether it's foreign food or meat out of the meat, dairy, and eggs out of the slaughterhouses. The end result is there isn't government inspectors because the bureaucracy isn't big enough to do it all. Number three is attempt to get rid of patronage. So the bureaucracy gets bigger as the public demands an end to patronage jobs and patronage approaches to politics. People do not want to see favoritism in the delivery of goods and services. Like, for example, in the city of Chicago, which has been, historically very, very democratic, the public wouldn't stand for having the city only plow snow in areas where the Democrats get their heaviest votes. We still see favoritism along those lines, but for the most part, it's not nearly as bad as it used to be. And the fact is that as the public says, no, we don't want that, we want objectivity and neutrality in the delivery of goods and services. You don't want to go to an office, say, for something like a license, like a driver's license, and then find out that you can't get a driver's license because you voted for the wrong party in the last election. So because that's the case, patronage is eliminated and bureaucracy increases. Another reason why the bureaucracy is so large is because this is a big country. For example, I mentioned already the Department of Agriculture that needs to be in every rural community in the United States because their farmers are there. And so the end result is that thousands of bureaucrats are administering the Department of Agriculture. Yeah, I use that here as an example too. This is a big country, not only geographically, but in terms of population. And as a result, we need a lot of administrators to carry out the laws that are passed. And then the next one is related to it, federalism. So we have federal system. What does that mean? That means we have government at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. And each one of those levels passes laws. Each one of those has an executive at its head, whether that's a mayor or city manager or governor or president. All of those levels, everyone also has a court system. Everyone has a legislature. So what happens then is the laws are magnified. You get more laws because you're in a federal system, and if you have more laws, more rulings, more actions by the executive, you're going to have somebody to carry it all out. And the bureaucracy gets huge based on that. Just look at what happened after 9/11. We developed, the government at the national level developed what was called Homeland Security, which was an effort to try and deal with the problem of terrorism, at least so far as it applies to taking airplanes at airports in the United States. So a huge bureaucracy is created around this issue of how are we going to fight terrorism. So you've got national, state, and local officials all working for Homeland Security, all attempting to work on this one problem of how to prevent terrorism in the United States. And that's just one thing in the whole bureaucracy. So you can see that the bureaucracy is really a major component of government in the United States. As a matter of fact, I didn't include it here in an effort to kind of keep the course simple, but you could actually see the bureaucracy as a separate branch of government, as a fourth branch of government, along with the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Okay, number 3, what makes the bureaucracy political? Number 1 would be if you violate the rules of objectivity and neutrality and the other rules that I mentioned, efficiency and so on. So you turn the bureaucracy into a political entity. That has been done. Sometimes it's even been done with the directive of the president. For example, President Nixon became very angry at some people. Actually, it was quite a list of people that he was angry about in the media, celebrities, and others that were practically anybody who went on television and criticized him. So that included a lot of journalists, a lot of celebrities, and so on. And so it became known as the president's enemies list. So President Nixon had this enemies list, and what he did was he went to the IRS and he asked the IRS to audit these people. So that's an example of using the rules in a way that's political, not objective and neutral. And that's happened over and over again, where people, because of some governmental problem, criticism of the president or whatever, other presidents as well, wind up with turning the bureaucracy into a political entity. Number 2, doing favors for some over others. Bureaucracies do this all the time. That is, they'll treat some people differently, treat some people more fairly. Classic example, I guess, would be the courts, which are supposed to be blind justice. You know, you got that image of Lady Justice holding up the scales of justice, and she's got a blindfold on. So, if you look at the criminal justice system, obviously, if you are a person of color, you're not treated as people who are white. So that's the problem of making the bureaucracy political. You're doing favors for some and letting other people go. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, when they were first getting started, that was their biggest problem, that the courts were playing loose and that's my doorbell if you could hear it. They're playing loose and free with with drunk driving. They get tough on other crimes, but that was one that to kind of let people go. And it wasn't until Mothers Against Drunk Driving brought a lot of publicity to the issue that it changed. Another reason is hiring people based on patronage rather than qualifications. Again, this happens all the time with the president because the president has at least a couple of thousand jobs that can be handed out to people as a kind of reward for helping out in the campaign or helping out in terms of campaign contributions. So that's what that often happens. I mentioned FEMA. I think that guy's name was Jackson, Michael Jackson or something like that at FEMA. I'd have to go look it up, but I can't remember the name. But anyway, that would be an example. But it happens a lot with cabinet members and people who are, people who are in positions in the White House. They're usually given to those who've been helpful in the campaign. Pressure placed by interest groups is another thing. That is, interest groups attempt to get people to get appointed to cabinet positions who are favorable to the interest group. Like, for example, the Department of Agriculture administers to farmers. They, the farming community would not be able to function without a favorable Department of Agriculture because farmers are heavily subsidized by the government. So they want to make sure that whoever's Secretary of Agriculture is going to be somebody who represents farmers, not the public, not the consumer who buys the food. So there's a lot of pressure on the part of interest groups to do that all the time to impact the bureaucracy, if not to get certain people that they favor as heads of those departments, but also to make sure that the policy followed in the department, in the bureaucracy, is favorable to the interest group. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Discretion to decide who is eligible, for example, like the police have to decide what laws to enforce. And one of the, something that's commonly on the books is gambling. But the police, like in Chicago, are not going to go running around breaking up card games because they've got more difficult cases to face. There's way too many murders in Chicago, so they're trying to run those people down. That's why they don't pay much attention to something like gambling. As a matter of fact, that you see a lot of people, if you drive in the city, you see a lot of people violating the traffic rules. And again, that's the same kind of problem. They put the priority on other things because they don't have enough police to deal with that. So discretion, deciding what to do. For example, like say for example, again, using the police as an example, if you get stopped by the police has a considerable amount of discretion when they stop you, say, for speeding, or not using your turn signal, or having a rear light out, or some traffic violation. They have a lot of discretion there. They can give you a ticket. They could give you a warning, that kind of stuff. And so that discretion makes it political because now it's not just the rules anymore. You broke the rule and therefore you get a ticket. Now there's some discretion in deciding what rules to favor, not only whether to stop people at all in traffic when they see a traffic violation, or once they do stop people, what action they could take if they give you a warning or they give you a ticket, or some people even get arrested and are taken to jail. So there's a lot of discretion, and discretion means that they're not treating people neutrally and objectively, and therefore it's political. And then another pressure, not just interest group pressure, but congressional pressure. So we talked about examples of the president putting pressure on the bureaucracy, like Nixon using the IRS, and then I'll talk in a minute here about interest group pressure. And there's also congressional pressure on the bureaucracy. When the IRS, again, back in the 1990s, the bureaucracy was, the IRS was being very tough, taking people's property and so on. And there was a lot of criticism by citizens that the IRS was being terribly unfriendly. And so the end result was that Congress put a lot of pressure on them to back off. And by the time the President Clinton was out of office, there was a considerable amount of a change in the IRS. So here's an example of pressure group pressure. This guy over here on the right, sitting in the blue suit, is Charles Keating. And Charles Keating was the head of Lincoln Savings and Loan. It was a huge savings and loan company, which kind of preceded the banking crisis. Back in the 80s, there was a savings and loan crisis. So what happened, if you're not familiar with the Keating case, was that Charles Keating, one of the major players in the savings and loan business, when the savings and loan, what happened was President Reagan deregulated the savings and loans. Savings and loans before Reagan came along were very, very strictly regulated. They could only use the money that was collected in the savings and loan company to finance local um, real estate. So if you want to buy a house, you could go to a savings and loan company and they would loan you the money. And that's basically what the savings and loan companies were all about. Then they got deregulated. That is to say, the regulation or limits on the savings and loan companies were lifted. And they could get into any kind of you spend their money on any kind of businesses they wanted. And Charles Keating was speculating in this real estate venture that wasn't in his state. It was in Florida, and he was building this like large recreational community in Florida. I forget what that was called, but anyway, so which was pressuring his savings and loan company because he didn't have enough money for all this. So there were 5 senators, including here, you can see the picture of the senators. There was 5 of them. The picture shows 4 here. But anyway, there was 5 senators. John McCain was one of them. And they were all heavily contributed to by Charles Keating. He gave money to them when they were running for office and running for Senate. So what happened was the regulators, the bank regulators, came to him and were putting a lot of pressure on him to withdraw that support for that real estate venture he was going on, I believe, in Florida. It was in a retirement community. It might have been in Arizona or something. I don't remember anymore. It's been so long. But anyway, he went to the 5 senators and he asked the 5 senators to sit down with the bank regulators that were giving him trouble and to tell him to beg off. And they did it. All 5 senators sat in an office or in Congress with a representative and told him to leave Charles Keating alone. And the end result was that Charles Keating was able to, to go on with his business. And of course, there was a banking crash because they didn't have enough money, and that things went kaput, and people lost all their money, much like what happens in the banking thing more recently, right after the housing bubble burst. So that's an example of pressure placed on government by interest groups on government officials who are giving them a hard time. And it's pretty amazing. And Charles Keating eventually went to jail. I don't know where he is now, but he eventually went to jail for his role in the whole mess. And he was asked, when you gave that money to those senators, were you trying to bribe them in the sense of, get him to act on your behalf? And he said, of course. What do you think? I'm stupid? I'm just going to give them money for nothing? What a system we live in. Huh? Okay, here's the last question. How does the president attempt to control the bureaucracy? Well, the most obvious thing is appointments. All the cabinet members, those pictures we saw of the cabinet sitting around. That's a way to control the bureaucracy, because the people at the top level, are going to be people that that are appointed by the president, do what the president wants. And if you don't do what the president wants, you're going to get fired. Or if you don't say what the president wants you to say, you'll get fired. The second thing the president does is the president can issue memos, that is directives to the department, telling them what he wants them to do. Now, they don't actually have to do what the president says. I remember Truman saying about Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was elected after him, he said, poor Ike, he's going to think this is like the military. You just give orders and everybody just jumps, because they don't often jump. But the president has an opportunity to tell them what to do. And, oftentimes they will do it. Another thing is executive orders. Now, that's a very important thing that the president can do. That is, he can, without the approval of Congress, he can make the law that affects the bureaucracy. So since it's the executive branch, and only the executive branch, he can issue a decree or order that's known as an executive order. A classic example is President Truman integrating the military. The military, before Truman became president, you had segregation, like all of American society. The military was separated into units that were black and those that were white. So the African Americans were not intermingling with white soldiers. And as a result, then in 1940, I think it was 1948 or whenever it was, that President Truman issued the order, then the military was no longer segregated but became integrated. So something like that can happen. President Clinton faced the same thing with gays in the military, but he wasn't as forceful as Truman. So executive order is a very important thing to control the bureaucracy. President Obama made a lot of speeches about torture and how we weren't going to torture anymore and all of that, but the executive order not to torture never came. Another thing you could do is, in addition to appointing officials, you can fire them. You can fire officials. And that's another way in which the president can control the bureaucracy. There's a very famous case of President Nixon firing people during the Watergate. What happened during the Watergate was there was a special prosecutor. His name was Archibald Cox, and he was a lawyer in Washington, D.C., very famous lawyer, and well known and everything. And so in order to get the heat off of him, that is the heat off of Nixon, he appointed a special prosecutor to investigate Watergate. So anyway, Archibald Cox was doing that, and he was finding against a number of people in the White House. Particularly, he got the two closest aides to President Nixon. He put a lot of pressure on them because he accused them of being involved in Watergate. That was Ehrlichman and Haldeman. And so by that point, Nixon was pretty mad. He was really upset that he was losing top officials in the White House staff because of Watergate. And so he wanted to put an end to it. And so he called the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, his name was. And he called Elliot Richardson, who was the Attorney General, and he says, I want you to fire Archibald Cox, because the special prosecutor worked for the Attorney General's office technically. And so the president didn't have control over him. But he went to the secretary, and he said, who was the Attorney General, and he said to Elliot Richardson, fire Archibald Cox. And Richardson said, I can't do that. He said, I made an agreement with the guy. We signed a statement saying that he was going to be independent and all of that. And so Nixon said, if you won't fire him, I'll fire you. And that's what he did. He fired Richardson. So then he calls up the next guy who was second in command, and that was Ruckelshaus, his name was. I forget his first name. Might have been Bill or something like that. I don't remember. But he called up Ruckelshaus, and he said to him, congratulations, you're now Attorney General. I just fired that bastard, Richardson. And he said the first job you're going to do as Attorney General is fire Archibald Cox. And Ruckelshaus gave him basically the same argument that Richardson had given him. I'm sorry, I can't do that because, we have this special agreement with him. He's free to do what he wants. And so then Nixon said to him, if you won't do what I want, you're fired. So he fired him. And then he calls up the third person in command, the third guy, who was Judge Bork at the time, Bork, who later was nominated for Supreme Court, didn't make it, but was nominated for Supreme Court by Nixon. He was asked to do it. He was the third guy down, and he was asked to do it, and he did it. He fired Archibald Cox. So that shows you the power of the president in the bureaucracy. This was called the Midnight Massacre. That's the media terminology for it. But the president has the power, at least at the top three people. Top three people. Now, if Bork would have said, no, I can't do it, and then we went down to the fourth person, I don't know who it was, but if we went down to the fourth person and Nixon called him, he could then tell the president, I'm not doing it and you're not firing me, because the president wouldn't have the power to do that. So anyway, it's pretty significant that the president could get his way because he fired two people and the third person finally did what he wanted. Another way to impact the bureaucracy is to affect the budget. Now, you can cut the budget of the departments you don't like, and you can increase the budget of the ones you do like. Again, if you go back to Nixon, I'm thinking a lot about Nixon these days, but Nixon inherited the Great Society from President Johnson. President Johnson had been president before Nixon, and there was all these liberal programs about jobs and all the rest. President Johnson saw himself as kind of like the FDR of the 1960s, and what he was going to do was he was going to try to provide everybody possible with a job. And so they had these departments and agencies that were designed to help people on the domestic side, whether it was get out of welfare, get a job, whatever it was, those kind of things. There were departments. Well, Nixon didn't like it. So what he did was he just simply cut the budgets in those areas. Another thing that you can do is, I didn't put it down here, but another thing you could do is reorganize. So you had Peace Corps, and what the president did, that was Nixon, what he did was he organized all the volunteer agencies, domestic and foreign, into the Peace Corps, and it kind of diminishes the whole operation that was prominent among the Democrats, that is President Kennedy and President Johnson. So you can really affect things by how much money you give them or how you reorganize the department so that they either have enough or they don't. Like if you don't like what they're doing, like for example, we've lived in this day and age of deregulation, and so cutting back on the number of inspectors, as I mentioned, of the food supply is just simply an effort to deregulate, that is to allow the companies to do it themselves. And that's why you have all these recalls now that you never had in the past, because now you don't have the government on their back telling them what they can do and cannot do. And then the last thing is publicity. The president can criticize, can be very critical of the bureaucracy, like President Reagan was of the Department of Education. Or you can be complimentary. You can give them some prestige by doing the latter, and give them a lot of trouble by being critical. So those are some of the things that the president can do to control the bureaucracy. And the president spends a lot of time trying to control the bureaucracy, because a lot of times the problems that the president faces are bureaucratically related. Like if something goes wrong, like the Katrina thing, that was a major disaster. I mean, it was originally caused by flooding, but the flooding was a result of bureaucratic neglect. The government had not done enough to keep the levees from breaking. And whether it's the Army Corps of Engineers or the Department of Agriculture and so on, all the departments that were supposedly responsible for making sure that there wasn't the big flood happening again in New Orleans, And so once it happened, then of course you get all this criticism, and it's directed at the president, and the only way the president can control it is through controlling the bureaucracy. So anyway, I hope that this was helpful.